When organizations try to protect information at scale, they often discover that controlling who can open, share, and redistribute data can be harder than controlling who can log in. That is where two related ideas come into play: digital rights management, DRM, and group-based access strategies. DRM is about applying persistent protection to content so that rules travel with the data, not just with the application that stores it. Group strategies are about managing access by assigning users to groups and granting permissions to groups rather than to individuals, which is a common way to keep authorization manageable. Both approaches can improve security and usability, yet both can also create a serious problem if implemented carelessly. Entitlement sprawl, where groups multiply, permissions pile up, and nobody can confidently explain who has access to what or why. Entitlement sprawl is not just an administrative inconvenience. It is a security risk because it leads to over-access, orphan permissions, and brittle controls that break during change. In this episode, we're going to focus on how to implement DRM and group strategies in a disciplined way that stays governable, avoids runaway complexity, and supports real workflows for brand new learners. By the end, you should be able to explain what DRM does, how groups are meant to simplify access management, why sprawl happens, and what architectural choices prevent your access model from becoming a tangled, unreviewable mess. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is by defining what entitlement sprawl actually looks like, because the term can sound abstract until you picture it. Entitlements are the rights an identity has, such as the ability to read a dataset, edit a folder, or forward a document, and those entitlements often come from membership in groups or roles. Sprawl happens when the number of groups or rights grows without a clear structure. So the environment accumulates hundreds or thousands of overlapping group names, nested memberships, and one-off exceptions. Over time, people join more groups to get their job done, then change roles but keep old groups, and soon many users have access far beyond their responsibilities. Sprawl also happens when each team invents its own group naming style and its own sharing habits, making it impossible to understand access consistently across the organization. A beginner misunderstanding is to assume that more groups automatically means more precision and therefore better security, but in practice, too many groups often means less clarity and less control. When access is unclear, reviews become meaningless, deprovisioning misses hidden pathways, and incident response becomes slower because investigators cannot quickly determine who could have accessed a sensitive file. Architects care about sprawl because it is the natural outcome of unmanaged growth, and the role of architecture is to design a structure that can scale without losing meaning. Preventing sprawl is not about limiting necessary access. It is about keeping access decisions understandable and maintainable as the environment evolves. Now consider what DRM is meant to do, because it solves a different problem than simple storage permissions. Traditional access control often protects a file while it sits in a specific repository, such as a file server or document platform. But once the file is copied or emailed, the repository's permissions may no longer apply. DRM is designed to make protection persist with the content itself, so that when the file moves, the rules still control who can open it, what they can do with it, and whether it can be forwarded or printed. This can be valuable for sensitive documents that may be shared across internal teams, partners, or devices. A beginner misconception is that DRM is just encryption, but DRM is broader. It includes encryption plus policy enforcement around usage, often involving identity checks and rights like view only, edit, or expiration. Another misconception is that DRM automatically solves data leakage, but DRM has practical limits, such as when someone can capture information by taking a screenshot or retyping data. Despite those limits, DRM can reduce casual leakage and can enforce rules that are otherwise difficult, such as preventing forwarding or setting automatic expiration. The architectural challenge is implementing DRM in a way that integrates with identity and groups without creating a maze of overlapping policies. If DRM policies and groups are both unmanaged, the complexity multiplies, and users and administrators lose track of what rules apply where. To implement DRM effectively, you have to define what content needs persistent controls and what does not, because using DRM everywhere can be costly and disruptive. DRM introduces friction, such as requiring reauthentication to open protected documents and restricting common behaviors like offline access or copying text. For low-risk content, that friction may not be worth it, and it can cause users to avoid the system or to move work into uncontrolled channels. Architects therefore start with a classification mindset, identifying categories of information that truly require persistent protection, such as high-sensitivity personal data, confidential business plans, or regulated data sets. They then define a small set of DRM policy templates that match those categories, rather than creating a unique policy for every team or every project. This templating approach is one of the most important anti-sprawl strategies because it prevents policy explosion and keeps the rules set understandable. Another key idea is aligning DRM policies with business processes, such as how documents are reviewed, approved, and shared externally, so DRM supports the workflow rather than fighting it. For beginners, the takeaway is that DRM is most effective when it is targeted and standardized, not when it is applied indiscriminately. Group strategies are often the backbone of access management because they allow you to grant permissions to a group and then manage who is in the group, rather than assigning permissions individually. This is scalable because group membership can be updated when people join, move, or leave, and the permissions follow automatically. Groups also support reviews because you can review membership in a meaningful group rather than reviewing 1,000 individual permissions. However, groups can become a sprawl generator if they are created without structure, naming standards, and lifecycle controls. A common beginner mistake is creating a group for every folder and then creating exceptions on top of exceptions, leading to hundreds of nearly identical groups that differ only by 1 or 2 members. Another mistake is using groups to represent temporary needs without expiration, which leads to permanent accumulation. Architects design group strategies by defining what groups represent, such as job functions, data categories, projects, or permission sets, and then limiting group types so people know where to request access. They also define ownership for each group, so someone is responsible for maintaining membership and reviewing it over time. Without ownership, groups become orphaned, and orphan groups are a major driver of entitlement sprawl. One of the most effective ways to prevent group sprawl is to separate groups that represent people from groups that represent permissions. A people group might represent a department or role, such as finance analysts, while a permission group might represent access to a dataset or application function. By separating these, you can map people groups to permission groups in a controlled way, reducing the need to add individuals directly to many permission groups. This separation also supports governance because it becomes clearer whether a person's access comes from their role or from an exception. Exceptions can then be handled as explicit, time-bounded membership in a permission group with a justification, rather than being hidden inside a role group. Another benefit is audit clarity because reviewers can evaluate whether someone belongs in the role group and whether they should have the permission group, and those are different questions with different approvers. Beginners often find this separation helpful because it reduces the temptation to just add them to the folder group, which is how sprawl begins. Architects also prefer to avoid deep nested group structures that become hard to understand because excessive nesting can create hidden access paths. If nesting is used, it should be shallow, documented, and governed so the structure remains understandable. The main point is that group design is a form of information architecture, and good information architecture needs clear types and boundaries. Another anti-sprawl strategy is to design for time, because many entitlements are needed only temporarily. Projects end, audits end, and temporary duties end, yet group memberships often remain because removal is forgotten. Time-bounded access can be implemented by requiring an expiration date at issuance, requiring periodic reapproval, or creating workflows that automatically remove membership unless renewed. This is especially important for high-risk groups, such as groups that grant access to sensitive data or administrative tools. Time bounding also helps align with least privilege because it prevents maybe I will need this later, access from becoming permanent. A beginner misconception is that time bounding is too hard to manage, but at scale it can actually reduce workload by preventing long-term cleanup. It also improves security posture because the environment naturally sheds stale access. Time bounding does introduce the need for renewal workflows that are simple and reliable, because if renewals are painful, people will demand permanent access again. Architects therefore design renewal paths that are predictable, include the right context for approvers, and are aligned with how work is scheduled. When time is part of the model, entitlement sprawl becomes less likely because the system is designed to forget access unless it is actively maintained. Now connect DRM and group strategies directly, because the most common approach is to tie DRM policy decisions to group membership. For example, a DRM policy template might say that members of a certain group can view and edit a document, while others can only view, and external sharing might be blocked unless another approved group is included. This can be effective, but it can also multiply sprawl if every DRM policy requires creating new groups. The architectural solution is to keep the number of DRM policy templates small and to reuse groups across templates rather than inventing new ones for each document. Another helpful approach is to base DRM rules on stable identity attributes, such as department or clearance category, when those attributes are well governed, rather than relying solely on ad hoc groups. However, attribute reliance can become risky if attributes are stale, so you need strong joiners, movers, leavers processes to keep them accurate. You also need to decide how DRM policies handle external partners, because partner access often requires different trust relationships and different monitoring. A disciplined design uses defined external sharing groups with clear ownership and review rather than letting every team create partner groups freely. For beginners, the key is to see that DRM is not only a document control feature. It is an entitlement system, and entitlement systems need the same governance discipline as any other access system. Entitlement sprawl is also driven by user behavior and incentives, so architecture must consider usability. If access requests are slow, users will pressure administrators to grant broad permissions to avoid delays. If DRM policies prevent legitimate collaboration, users will copy content into unprotected formats or shadow systems. If group naming and request paths are confusing, users will ask for whatever makes it work, and that often becomes an overly broad group membership. Architects prevent this by designing a small number of clear access packages, making request processes predictable, and ensuring that most users can get what they need through well-defined roles rather than through constant exceptions. They also design clear user guidance, such as how to choose the correct protection level for a document, without turning the experience into a training burden. The goal is to make the secure path the easy path, because entitlement sprawl is often a symptom of an access model that does not fit how people actually work. Governance without usability becomes an enforcement battle, and battles create workarounds. When the model fits, users and administrators can follow it naturally, and sprawl becomes less likely. Monitoring and review are the final safety net that keeps group and DRM strategies from drifting into chaos even when initial design is good. Group membership reviews should focus on high-risk groups and on exception memberships, because those are where sprawl creates the most danger. DRM policy usage should be monitored for patterns, such as documents repeatedly shared outside intended boundaries or frequent requests for broad access, which may indicate that policy templates do not match real workflows. Another important signal is dormant entitlements, where a group grants powerful access but members rarely use it, suggesting the access may be unnecessary or may be a legacy artifact. Reviews should also include ownership checks, ensuring every group and every DRM policy template has an accountable owner who can answer questions about purpose. When ownership is missing, sprawl accelerates because nobody feels responsible for cleanup. Architects also design for incident response, ensuring that in a suspected data exposure event, teams can quickly identify who had access to which documents and when those documents were accessed. That requires consistent identifiers and reliable logging that connects group membership to access events. For beginners, the key takeaway is that governance is not only about setting rules. It is about continuously verifying that the entitlement system still reflects reality and still supports safe collaboration. Implementing DRM and group strategies without creating unmanageable entitlement sprawl requires designing for structure, reuse, time, and governance from the beginning. DRM provides persistent protection that can travel with data, which is valuable for sensitive content, but it should be applied selectively using a small set of standardized policy templates rather than endless custom rules. Group strategies can make authorization scalable by granting permissions to groups rather than individuals, but groups must be designed with clear types, ownership, and naming standards so their meaning remains stable. Separating people groups from permission groups, limiting nesting complexity, and using time-bounded memberships for temporary needs are practical anti-sprawl measures that keep access aligned with purpose. Tying DRM policies to groups can be powerful, but it must be done with careful reuse and governance so policy decisions do not explode into thousands of overlapping groups. Usability matters because users will find workarounds if secure collaboration is too hard, and workarounds create the very sprawl and risk you are trying to prevent. When you can explain how persistent protection and group-based access can be designed as a coherent, reviewable entitlement system, you are demonstrating an ISSAP-style mindset that values both security and operational sustainability. The deeper lesson is that authorization is not only about controlling access today. It is about building an access structure that stays understandable and defensible as documents, teams, and systems change over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.